Before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of the items you'll need to be able to do this. First of all, you're going to need one of the Patterns of Fashion books. You'll also need some basic pattern drafting paper, a basic dressmaker's curve, sometimes called a French curve, sometimes called a hip curve. I like to have a see-through one because it makes it easier for me to see the lines that I've already created and how this curve will lay against those. I also use a see-through ruler, which is a little bit smaller. And then whatever type of cutting device you like to use, a lot of people will just simply use scissors to cut paper because it dulls your blade a lot quicker than cutting fabric. Or you can use your rotary cutter, but make sure that you have a blade that's specifically for cutting paper. So I take this blade off and store it and then mark it with like a P to indicate that I just use it for cutting paper. That way I'm not messing with any of my fine fabrics. I also use pattern weights to hold down the edges of the pattern drafting paper. Since this stuff is stored in a tubular fashion, the edges, as you can already see it's happening, will curve up on you, which is so annoying. So make sure you have these. Okay, so here we go. Now that you have all of the materials that you will need to actually draft this pattern, what we're going to do is we're going to cut out a section of the pattern drafting paper that will accommodate whatever particular piece of the pattern you're cutting out. So I've already cut out quite a bit of this pattern, and today I'm just going to cut out the middle part of the front bodice, the over bodice. And the reason I'm not showing you all of this is I'm not sure that I can legally do that because of copyright. So you should be able to see sort of just this portion on your screen. And we're going to cut today out this deal right here. And one of the really great things about Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion is that she makes it really easy on people trying to draft patterns, as every single little square that you see here represents 1 inch in a human-sized pattern. So I could go into more detail on that, but I will save you the long explanation. So when you're looking at, say, this particular pattern piece, it makes it a lot easier to decide, oh, okay, this is how I'm going to cut this out. This is going to measure approximately X number of squares, which translates to X number of inches here on the actual pattern paper. So when I'm doing this, I basically just start by counting. It's a lot of counting. And I will go in and I will find my very first straight line, because it's always easy when you're pattern drafting, easier to start on a straight line and then work from there. So our main straight line here is the center front. Since this kind of goes over the bodice, it's sort of the middle part of the bodice of the dress. You can see it right here, the middle part of the bodice here. It's going to have its main line at the center front, and that's going to be cut on the fold. So what I'm going to do first is count out, all right, how many inches down is this, so that I can mark my very first straight line. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 and 3/4. Great. So then I will move over as far as possible, because as you probably saw in the textbook, this is going to be a longer pattern piece. And I will go over here and I will make myself a lovely straight line. And as I mentioned in the earlier video, sometimes I use the longer straight edge on the dressmaker's curve, because this one won't quite cut it. So because I have a little bit of an OCD thing going on, I'm just going to recount it just to make sure that we match. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12, 13, 14, 15 and 3/4. Great. It matches the initial count. So then I'm going to go down here, and this ruler is actually 16. So if I put this at 16 up here, I can go all the way down to about 3/4 and mark it there. And then I'm going to erase the extra little bit that I traced, and we'll call these the edges of this particular pattern piece. Now, as I said before, this is the center front, so I'm going to mark this with CF, and that's a really ugly CF, but oh well, you get it. And then the other thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna mark the cut on fold indicator. And that's really easy to do. You just draw a straight line and then 2 perpendicular lines down with arrows. And this is just a way to remind yourself to cut it on the fold. Okay, so we have our first straight line, and what I like to do from there is start bringing this curve down to the center back. Okay, so one thing that I do that's been very helpful is I circle all of the little spots where the lines intersect with the inch markers here in the pattern. So we've got one there, see that's it intersects right like a plus mark, and that makes it a lot easier for me to graph it. Right here is an intersection, and then let's see if there's any more. Right here is an intersection, and then there's the edge. So this will make it a lot easier for me to graph as I go. And to do that, oops, and see, as I said, the edges will just start curling up on you and drive you up the wall. As I do this, the way that I want to start is just by basically taking the slope of the line. Now, don't freak out. I realize that I just said a math term, but you don't actually know you're doing the math unless you think about it that way. So this is literally addition and subtraction. So this is 3 over 1, 2, 3, and there's your mark. So I go 1, 2, 3, and there's my first mark. And I just like make a little X there. So when I'm tracing, it becomes easier for me to connect the dots. And then I'm going to go down, okay, look, here's my second intersection, and that is 2 down from this first mark, and let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 10 over. So again, I'm going to go 2 down, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and mark again. And then I'm going to look for my third mark, and that is, again, 2 down, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 over. So 2 down, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, mark again. And then our last mark will be where the center back or the end of this particular pattern piece is. So we've got 1 down and almost 2 over. 1 down and almost 2 over. And in fact, it's not all the way 1 down. It's like a 1/4 inch from all the way down. So we're going to go out right there. Okay, great. And then I'm going to mark this back line right here because I have this mark, so I might as well just continue in a clockwise direction. And according to this, and I like to count, by the way, on the actual intersections. Some people will say this is 1, 2, 3. I count 1, 2, 3 because otherwise my brain gets confused and I'm like, oh, did I count the centers or did I count the intersections? Just do whatever you want, but keep it uniform. That way you don't confuse yourself. So where my point is right above this intersection, and on this book, we check that. Okay, great. So that's 1 point, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, almost 7 in the same sort of general area. So I count here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, almost 7, and I put my point there. I'm going to check it again and see what the angle looks like, a little higher based on what the book says. Excellent. And then I'm going to go ahead and draw myself a beautiful line. And another way to make sure that this is straight is I can line up, this is why I use a see-through ruler. I can line up, say, these ones, and with this, you can't see it, it's like this opaque white line that sort of is a guide there. I can line that up and make sure that that looks good. And then once I am satisfied, great. And then I'm going to draw my line. There's the back. And as you'll see as well on the actual Janet Arnold pattern, she has a lot of markings here. So typically I will just start transferring those right off the bat. There is, let's see, there's an original marker about 1 3/4 up from the end. So about there. And then here to here, 1, 2, 3, 4. She's saying is supposed to be about 4 inches. Great. And then what I'll end up doing is I'll measure this out, so that's perfect. When you're sort of recreating this, it can get a little funky. And really what she wants you to do is ruche all this, or like pleat, not exactly pleat it, but kind of bring it together, almost like gathering it so that it sets in the front of the bodice like a gathered kind of pretty sort of effect. So at the end, once this is all done, this should be 4 inches. And then also, we're going to cut this line here in a minute. That will end up being 4 inches too. So that will give you an idea how the fabric's going to go like that. And it'll create this ruched effect. Okay, cool. So I have my mark there. Here's where the waistline will go. And then I'm going to come back down here and do the same thing that I did up top. And in fact, I think I'm actually going to go from over here and do that. That way I don't end up oopsing. So again, I'm going to circle the little areas where the pattern intersects with the plus marks on the pattern paper. Let's see, about there. And then I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so here's my end. And the first mark is going to be this line. And how many over? Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, about 9. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I'm going to put an X, and then I'm going to go to the next one. Again, 1 up and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over. 1 up and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over. Great. And then we have our last line here. Great. Then the tracing begins. So remember how I said that there's this waistline here too? That's going to also translate all the way over to here, the center front as well. So we'll put that on after here in a moment. Then I'm going to take my hip curve and I'm going to begin the process of figuring out how I want this curve to look. I'm going to use the text to inform how my curves look, but then I'm also going to help myself with those marks that I put. So if I look at the text here, the very first mark that I put on the pattern paper is about 9 spaces in. And it looks like the curve just is a pretty steady incline up with a little bit of a drop over here. So I'm just going to check that out on my hip curve and see if I can find that. Now sometimes you want to turn it over because the drop in the hip curve, as you can see, happens around this area. And so if you want the drop to be further over here, turn the hip curve this way. If you want the drop to be further over here, turn the hip curve the other way. And again, this is why we have a see-through hip curve. So I'm going to take a look there. I'm going to take a look again at the text and see, okay, am I achieving this? Does this look like how I want it to look? Not quite. It needs to be a little bit more sloping. Yep, there we go. That looks pretty good. And then I'll draw my first line. Great. Then I'm going to do the same exact thing for the next line. Again, I'm going to check out the curve. Okay, here we go. Check the text. Does this look very similar? Yes, it does. Continue the line. And then last but not least, now over here on this final bit, the drop is a little bit more this way. So I'm going to change this over to here. I'm going to match up my 2 lines. And draw it out. Boom. And now we have this nice pretty line. And then sometimes you'll get these like weird sort of almost pointed deals. And what you want to do to fix that is just bring your curve back in and kind of fix the line a little bit with your pencil. And then erase any extra shenanigans that occur. Okay, and that will give you a little bit of a cleaner line. And then I'll just check again. Does this look like what it looks like in the book? Yes, it does. Great, moving on. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, I said that it was about 1 3/4 inches from the the underband portion to the center waist portion. So I'm going to go ahead and actually translate that to the human size pattern. So I'm going to go from the bottom and I'm going to take a look at the mark that I put. And let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. I kind of like where it is right now, so I'm going to go ahead and keep that. And this ended up being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5/8 of an inch. So I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to mark that throughout the entire curve. And that will give me a basis on which to draw the next curve. So again, let's see, here we go. And again, I turned the curve on this bottom one, and you can tell just by the way that the curve falls. And if you really want to get super hardcore with it, you can get your other ruler out and put it up against and make sure that you're measuring the same distance throughout. Okay, good. Then I'm just going to go back and check this. And sometimes you'll get this kind of situation where there's this, see where this is up here and I need to get from here to here. But if I do that, it's going to create this kind of ugly uptick there, and I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball it here, get it to where I want it. Not too much. And again, you have to kind of move your curve around to see where the lines are going to be best for you. And sometimes what you can do is you can even go back to the line before and kind of play games like this instead. And then that way, the only problem that you have to watch out for is that you don't end up with a section that's like significantly smaller than the other sections. There we go. And then I'm just going to erase the extra, and there you go. You end up with a similar type double line bottom to this pattern piece. And again, right here, it looks a little funky. So I'm going to come back and just kind of shore this up. You end up with a nice line. And you can even go back with your straight edge and check. See right here, I'm a little smaller. There. Not bad though. It's teeny, teeny, teeny. So you just want to make sure that you're about on target throughout the entire line. And this will also start to sort of morph as you get into the actual sewing aspect of it. Okay, so now we need to do the same thing for the top line. So let us do that. Same sort of situation. You check out the book, check out how she has this done. Oftentimes you can tell sort of how the curve's gonna fall just based on how the text looks. And sometimes you get really lucky and it'll just line up between multiple dots at the same time, so you don't have to play too many games. There we go. And again, this is sort of eyeballed in a lot of areas. I don't always adhere super specifically. Like if for instance, the line here isn't exactly perfect, I'm eyeballing it because then I can go back and sort of shore it up. There we go. See, so that curves a little better. And then if there's excess, I just go back and I erase that and make it pretty. And I make sure that this curve is nice and pretty. Yeah, great. There we go. And then if you check out the text one more time, you'll notice that they have a 1-inch band line because this particular bodice cover is lined on top with a sequin band. And so I'm just going to mark that throughout. And again, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take my straight edge and I'm going to mark 1 inch down from all of the, I don't know, every couple inches on the pattern. And that way I can easily connect those without too much trouble. Great. And I'm going to go back and do the same. See, again, you're not really doing math. You're kind of doing math, but it's not the kind of math where you're like, oh God, this is terrible. So, I don't know, somebody's probably going to see this and be like, I can't believe you called that math. What the heck's wrong with you? Okay. And again, I'm kind of just eyeballing it. I don't need it to be so exactly precise that it's, you know, clinical. Okay, and then I'm going to take a look. Am I missing anything else discussed on this? And then I'm going to mark my pattern too. And then this is center back, so I'm going to put CB to indicate center back. And then also they have a overlap for the right side, and they want us to mark that, and that is approximately 2 inches from the edge. So I'm going to take my straight edge yet again, and I'm going to mark 2 inches from the edge right there and right there. And I'm going to take it and draw that out. And then she even puts a little indicator right here. And she says overlap on R.S, which means right side, to conceal hooks and eyes. Great. And then also in the text, she marks here to here and puts 4 inches. So as I was mentioning earlier, she wants sort of this 4-inch theme to carry through the entire bodice, because when I actually put this onto the under bodice, I'm going to take these edges and go and smush them down into like a 4-inch strip that goes across the bust. So I'm kind of just marking all of this so that when I do cut it out, it makes sense. And then the last thing that I'm going to do to make this understandable is I'm going to add, or excuse me, to make this translatable to cutting fabric, is I'm going to add a seam allowance. And to add seam allowance, I'm just going to go, because remember, all of the patterns in Patterns of Fashion don't show seam allowance. I typically work off of a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Some people like 5/8, some people like 1/4. And when I'm marking seam allowance, I do a dashed line like that. And then I go around, and this ruler is epic because it has my favorite seam allowance already indicated on here. And then if you're the type of folk that like 1/4 inch seam allowance, it's indicated on that side too. So you can just immediately go all the way around and start with the marking. And now I have this beautiful pattern piece with the seam allowance included, all of the initial markings that Janet Arnold put in her recreation of the pattern. And I'm just checking one more time, always check one more time before you cut it out, that you have everything marked. So one thing that I do see is on the original pattern that Janet Arnold created, she has this little area marked as left under velvet band. So I'm just going to put that on there so that I don't have to mark it later. And then the best part is I'm going to cut it out. So remember, you don't need a seam allowance on the center front because this is cut on the fold. And again, please, by all means, use scissors if you are not familiar with a rotary cutter. Rotary cutters are maybe one of the most dangerous tools of sewing that I am aware of. The first time that I got this bad boy out and started cutting fabric with it, I was horrified. The kinds of injuries that women have had, well, men, seamstresses in general, have had using rotary cutters are appalling. So if you do not have experience using a rotary cutter, don't use one. Use scissors and save the functionality of your hand. And there we go. recreation of a pattern piece from the micro size pattern piece in Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion.